Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. In this episode, we're going to be talking about something a little different than usual. So, we've talked a lot about how themes are timeless in the Middle-earth story and how that makes them popular. But is there anything about the show that might make it less popular? So, for instance, we have the Rings of Power show. It's didn't do great. Was that because they saw themes in, Middle Earth and from Tolkien that they didn't want to include and stick as close to the storyline? Or is that more of, let's say, like lore? Maybe the deep lore is something that isn't as interesting to people.
I'm
Go ahead.
I'm gonna go in two directions on this. The first direction is basically that second point you made, is that the stuff is really dense and deep, and it's good if you're really into it, but it's also kind of niche. So, I have no problem spending hours, reading wikis and articles and appendices and books and things like that to get into the most obscure and weird stuff that Tolkien wrote. But for your average fan, some of that stuff, it's just gonna be like, this is boring. I just want to see Frodo drop some jewelry in a mountain. Like, you're not gonna capture as wide an audience by going into the more, the minutia and the more specific things. Which is why it's a little bit odd to me that they spent more money on this show than anything else, because it does seem like such a niche concept. The other aspect is that I am wondering if the tastes of the tastes of the general public are starting to shift again, specifically when it comes to heroes. So I think with things like Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, and you see this in certain superhero movies even, where there aren't really any true heroes because it's seen as being unrealistic, and so you don't get these paragon characters, and so they stray a little bit from the story by making Galadriel be this kind of edgy, kind of no nonsense, not quite anti-hero, but she's not really portrayed as oh, this great paragon of virtue that can go and do this stuff. And I think they're a little behind the times on this, because I think with the oversaturation of things like Game of Thrones, shows like Game of Thrones, and even to some extent things like The Witcher, where it's the protagonist, the main characters, they don't let them be the good guys fully. And I think, you see this backfire in Game of Thrones, because by the end of the show, it's well, there are no likable characters left, and they're just trying to subvert expectations. And so I think that, to some extent, a lot of the distaste is that it's not so much that they went off in their own direction, it's that they went off in their own direction in a way that they thought would be popular and probably would have been more well received 10 years ago, when these sorts of stories were on the rise. And I think to save the show, they need to basically lean into the high fantasy, epic fantasy, the good guys are good and the bad guys are bad, and it's a clash of good and evil, rather than oh, everybody's shades of gray, because yeah, in real life, in a lot of cases there are shades of gray, but it's not real life, it's fantasy, and the point of the story is to give us those heroes that we can look up to, rather than, trying to subvert our expectations or pull the rug out from underneath us or something like that.
In Tolkien's work, especially, Tolkien says a lot of very interesting things and profound things about good and evil itself because he personifies them in characters like Galadriel or Sauron, and so that is like really easy. I think you're right that they sort of did make this like a very much a shades of gray characters, where Sauron is like struggling whether he's evil, and Galadriel isn't sure whether she's good. She wants to like massacre all the orcs and stuff. But yeah, I think also there was something that was like thinking about the other day. I was like, what all in Rings of Power show the first season do they cover that like what it like how much of like Tolkien's lore do they cover? And the surprising thing, I think, is like not a lot. Like Tolkien talks a little bit about the making of the Rings of Power. He talks a little bit about like the dwarves mining and stuff, and maybe a little bit about Numenor. But like in terms of actual events and not just like scenes or places, it's actually very little. Very few events. Like Tolkien never writes about like how Mordor started or about characters in the Southlands. This whole like plot line with the Mithril and like Khazad-dûm is also not something Tolkien talks about. So like, sort of these things are like sort of interesting. Like if the show is like trying to like, oh, you know, like this lore is like not so much like for modern times or whatever, like they didn't really adapt a whole lot of the lore. And maybe they're setting up future events or something, but like I still think that like yeah, the show like if it made any mistakes, it made it because it was its own show and not because it was trying to adapt themes that are outdated from Tolkien's work.
I think also, just to make a note on that, and you might be thinking about this, but we've brought it up before, is how like the only thing they can go off of is the appendices, I guess. So
Yeah.
and I can't really even remember enough of it or and whatnot to even say like, oh, this is something they could or couldn't put in. But yeah,
Yeah, I was gonna say too that like I think a lot of their blunders were in the parts they had to fill in, for the most part, because like you said, there's really not a lot that they could like. If they wanted, they could have done the entire story in one season if they just were adapting what Tolkien wrote. But if I'm being completely honest, that wouldn't have been very interesting to watch. It would have basically been a documentary, which, like, I'm down for documentaries, but, like, from the perspective of Amazon, that's not going to make them back their money. So, um, and I will say, sort of a side note to what I was saying earlier, it's not that Tolkien doesn't have characters that are, gray morality or anti heroes or things like that. Like, you look at Turin, um, you look at even the portrayal of our Farazan, where like he's definitely evil, but like he's also looked back on as like the greatest king of Numenor. Um, and like you look at Fëanor, he's like, as I've described it before, the best elf and the worst elf, where it's like he does all these terrible things, but he also does all these great things and wonderful things that it's not a oh, the bad things detract from the good things. It's like, yeah, we're accepting that this guy is good and terrible. And I think that that sort of gray, complex characterization is a lot different from the way that the modern complex or gray characters, where it's like, because like most of the times when you have a character that's like kind of a gray morality kind of character, it kind of ends up just being a bad person. Like their bad deeds tend to overwrite their good deeds, and that's how they're viewed. Whereas with Tolkien's characters that were sort of middle of the like gray morality kind of characters, they were definitely portrayed as like almost like the good things they did and the bad things they did were on different scales. And so it's like you could be hypothetically like you could be 100% on the bad scale while also being 100% on the good scale because like Fëanor burned all the Teleri ships and did all these horrible things, but also he created the like most pure and good objects in the universe. So having that, I think that's another thing where if they wanted to go and create these stories in a way that fit with Tolkien's themes, that's how they would portray their gray, quote unquote, gray characters, while also having these paragon of good and, for lack of a better term, paragon of evil characters, where it's like, yeah, some of these characters are all good, some of these characters are all bad, and some of these characters do good and bad things in equal measure. And I think that because of the way modern storytelling treats gray morality characters, they're treating them more in the modern way rather than in the Tolkienian way.
I've talked about this on the show a lot, but I think it's the most interesting change that the Rings of Power made, the one you were talking about, Matt. But I think if you like, say you take a look at like the Lord of the Rings story itself, not the Silmarillion for the time being, but like you have Sauron on one side who's like totally evil, like he literally loves just being cruel, torturing, wants to conquer the world. On the other side, you have these characters like Galadriel, Elrond, and Gandalf, who are like the totally good characters. And then you have these like characters who are like sort of in the middle. You have like characters like Boromir, the Hobbits, Aragorn, who are sort of like, hey, we're on the good side, but they are very easily tempted by evil, and they have this clear choice laid out before them whether to accept or reject their fate or like the good side, or to ally themselves with the bad side. And you think you have characters like Denethor or like Saruman, but if you really notice, like these characters are always corrupted by something. So like Saruman and Denethor are both corrupted by the Palantir, which is like Sauron, right? You think of like Theoden, who's in turn corrupted for a time by Saruman. And the hobbits are always corrupted by like the ring or something, right? Like or Gollum is corrupted by the ring. But there's always like this really clear of like, hey, this is like the source of where evil is in people, and it's like genuinely like this evil force that is working on the inside, or it's like this external force as Sauron. I think what the Rings of Power has done is like it took like the characters in the Lord of the Rings that are like the paragons of like say evil Sauron and made him like he's sort of gray, right? He's like just wants to be like a guy in Numenor and just wants to be a humble person working in the forge. And it took like the characters like Galadriel, Elrond, and Gandalf, and you know I assume the stranger is Gandalf, but it's like, am I good? Galadriel is going around like I'm going to murder all the orcs and I'm going to kill them right in
Yeah.
front of you, like right to Adar. And then Elrond is sort of like not like evil, but playing these like political mind games. And it was sort of like, hey, these characters that were like quite literally Tolkien's personifications of good and evil, you've made like into the gray characters. And like we could have seen something totally different. We could have seen like the men characters as being the ones who are being caught and twisted like or between the forces that are around them, and still
Yeah.
have these like shining paragons. It's just that these like paragons in the Lord of the Rings, like Galadriel and Elrond, were never meant to be main characters in a story, right? Like they were meant to
Yeah.
be like the characters that the main characters encounter and that change them as a people, and not to be like the main characters of their own story. And so I think it's like real like they're clearly they have to adapt these characters, but I just think that this is like the biggest change they made in Tolkien's work, and I don't know if
Yeah.
I really like it very much. And you could have had like new characters, right? You could have had like the men of the nine Nazgul who like before, right? They're becoming tempted. Maybe there's other people in the show who are rejecting evil, but yeah, you could have done it very differently than they did.
Yeah.
But yeah,
One thing I think is just what you said there a minute ago is about like Elrond and Galadriel being the main characters. I think that's a big part to like why like I think for instance that like Elendil could have been a great main character.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um yeah, because I think there's I don't know, just like so many things that like him and his family have like a role to play that you know that
or
Yeah.
a
could have
Isildur, right?
started off.
I mean, Isildur, I feel like, is the quintessential gray character for
Right.
this story because he comes in and he founds Arnor,
Yes.
and he's like this great king of men, but he also doesn't destroy the ring and is tempted by the ring. So, like, yeah, having Isildur be a gray character is a great call because he is a gray character in Tolkien's work. But then, yeah, going back and having like, and especially since it's not a Silmarillion show, like, I think you could get away with the elves being gray characters in the Silmarillion, because the Silmarillion is basically how the elves came in and ruined everything. Um, but I, I think that, yeah, for this kind of show, focusing on the men, and even to some extent the dwarves, because the dwarves always have that kind of atmosphere and aura of like, yeah, they're good at heart, but they always sort of do something that messes up, like digging too deep and
Greed.
yeah, greed. So like focusing on the men and to some extent the dwarves in the, like, basically having the men with Galadriel's story and the dwarves with Elrond's story be the ones that are, flawed, would have been a better call than having Galadriel be this angsty, elvish equivalent of a teenager sort of thing.
Well, I think what you said is like absolutely true that a lot of stories are writing very great characters because it's like meant to reflect our world in some sense, right? Like people, we hear a lot of statements today like everybody's the main character in their own story or something like that, right? Like nobody ever thinks they're the bad guy. And so it's sort of
Yeah.
hard for us to like portray characters like Sauron, right? Who's like literally like I'm gonna conquer the world and I dress in all right, like and stuff like that. But I think it's also like Tolkien didn't mean like the whole point of fantasy is to not write something that's like a real story, right? That like we can sort of have like a fun adventure where the lines are clear and we don't have to like wonder who's the good guy or who's the bad guy in
Yeah.
this case and bring our like moral compasses like to bear and have to like figure out, oh, who am I rooting for? I think that's like part of
Yeah.
the fun of fantasy. And I will say like what we've said about Galadriel, like if there was one thing that like even the people who like the show that I talked to, like if there was one complaint they had, it was like the portrayal of Galadriel and that
Yeah.
she wasn't relatable in a lot of ways, or that like it didn't follow Tolkien's work and
Yeah.
how she's portrayed in say the movies. So
To bring in an example from completely out of left field, and I have not seen this movie. I've seen a lot of clips from this movie. This made me want to watch it, but John Mulaney's character in Puss in Boots 3, Big Jack Horner, he has gotten a lot of focus because he is really the first villain we've gotten in a while that just realizes he's a villain and just revels in it and is like, yeah, I'm a terrible person and I really enjoy the fact that I'm a terrible person. And I think that the reason he's been so refreshing is because we've gotten such a slew of villains recently that have been like, oh, well, nobody understands me and I have these motivations for doing it. And his entire premise is that he's poking fun of all those and it's just like, no, he's just a terrible person. And I think that a lot of people really enjoyed that because they could finally have a villain where it's like, I don't have to feel bad for rooting against this character because this character is clearly having fun with this. And I think that's the way they should have gone with Sauron, is where it's just like, oh, and I kind of think there's a chance they can still do that if in later seasons they kind of reveal that his whole sort of personality in the show so far has been a complete ruse and like just him trying to manipulate Galadriel. Where it's just like, no, he's evil to the core and he loves it. Because I think that people want that kind of storytelling again. I think they want the bad guys to be just bad guys, and I think that it'll take a few years for Hollywood to be like, oh, wait a minute, people want this.
yeah, it's funny because everybody I know has been talking about Puss in Boots, like the latest movie, and I'm like, okay, like this movie, I have to go see it now, I guess. But
Yeah, I know.
but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's interesting though. At least, like I think different like genres, like we want different things out of our stories, right? Like maybe if it's like a real world drama, but like this is a fantasy story, like we can have
Yeah.
evil characters. I think just really quick bounce back to the Silmarillion, where like you're like, oh, like Feanor is just like even Feanor was like clearly corrupted by Morgoth, right? Like it was Morgoth working on him.
Oh
And,
yeah.
like even if you think of like Turgon, like Morgoth cursed Tyrion's family line, or Turin, sorry. Like
Yeah.
Morgoth cursed his family. Like, there's always like this like source of the evil as like Morgoth, and like he
Yeah.
works through other people, and like his power like affects greater things. But like it's always like really clear that like, hey, these characters are corruptible, but like we know that like where the evil is in this story, right? We know where
Yeah.
the bad guy is.
Oh yeah.
I think yeah, just like bounce back to the main thing. It's like this is like one of Tolkien's hallmarks, and I think it actually would be very popular in a show these days. And it's not one of the reasons why the show should have adapted more of that work rather than like it's not the reason it would. I think it wouldn't have failed just because it did that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. consider supporting my movement on Facebook, Keeping the Rings of Power Pure.